The to-do list for sure.
The to-do list? Yeah.
Okay, we are live.
All right, fantastic.
We have 54 viewers online.
Okay.
So welcome everybody to the talk, The Last Duel and the Duel That Never Happened. My name is David Duke and I'm the head of the Department of History and Classics, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Mariah Cooper, who is currently teaching 2 courses in the Department of History and Classics focusing on medieval history. This is the specialization of her doctoral research, and her very soon to be defended doctoral dissertation is entitled The Body of Proof, Representations of Rape in Medieval English Legal and Literary Sources. I'm going to have to mute that. Mariah comes to Acadia from Memorial University of Newfoundland. Before that she's been working on her doctoral studies there since 2017. And before that she completed an MA in History at Memorial and 3 undergraduate degrees and diplomas from Queen's University, Trent University and the University of Kent in the United Kingdom. She's published in the fields of women and gender history with a focus on the medieval period, and has delivered conference presentations on her research in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and in January 2022 she'll be presenting a paper virtually in person, whatever COVID allows, to the Gender and Medieval Studies Conference of the American University of Paris on sexual violence and the legal responses to it. On the downside, and nobody's perfect, I do suspect that it was during her time in the United Kingdom that she started to support entirely the wrong soccer team, namely Chelsea. But she's also a passionate fan of the sweet science of boxing and has many opinions on the feasibility of uniting all of the heavyweight title belts. But on the upside, we are extremely lucky to have such an expert on medieval gender, sexuality, and legal structures to help us understand the complexities evident in The Last Duel, and we look forward to your presentation, Mariah. And the presentation itself will be approximately 30 to 40 minutes in length, and there will be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So with that, will you please join me in welcoming Mariah Cooper as she enlightens us on The Last Duel and the Duel That Never Happened. Mariah.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you. Thank you for being with me here today. I know the weather is not the best, but I really appreciate it, and thank you to those of you who are joining us virtually. So Ridley Scott's movie adaptation of Eric Jager's 2004 nonfiction book, The Last Duel, follows the story of 2 aspiring knights of the 100 Years' War, Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, and the accusation by Carouge's wife Marguerite that Legris had raped her. Set in 1386 during the depths of the 100 Years' War between France and England, the story follows the last royal sanctioned duel in France by Marguerite's husband, Carouge, and the accused rapist, Legris. The star-studded cast of Ben Affleck as Liege Lord Count Pierre, Matt Damon as Jean de Carouge, Adam Driver as Jacques Legris, and Jodie Comer as Marguerite has attracted a lot of popular attention from popular audiences and movie critics alike. So this is perfect, since no one in the room, I believe, has actually seen The Last Duel. I'm going to just show you a movie clip to give you a sense of what the film is like. If it cooperates. Perhaps not.
There it is.
the express permission of our Lord the King. Each man is to fight on horseback and on foot, armed with a manner that pleases him with any weapon on the life of a taxpayer. Instead, weapons will be likely of equal design, or maybe charms, smell, and so on. Any other thing that is forbidden by God and Holy Church to all good Christians. Like a man shall carry on to the field of battle, any arms that have been forged with spell, charms enchanted, or any other arms, and so shall the malefactor be punished with the enemy of God, or as a traitor, or as a murderer.
Knights, proceed.
I am telling the truth. I want him to answer for what he has done.
The most unspeakable charge has been brought against you.
This man, do nothing but evil to me!
Why are you innocent of the crime? I request a duel to the death. The accusation is false.
What happened to me is wrong.
I can only reverse it. One of us is mine. Let us let God decide. Confess! The Last Duel. Rated R. Only in theaters October 15th. Tickets on sale now.
All right. I hope I've convinced you to go see the movie. All right, so as repeated in the trailer, on December 29th, 1386, King Charles VI of France watched among a large crowd to see the divinely ordained outcome of the duel between Carouge and Legris. The woman at the center of it all, quite literally put in the center of the dueling pitch, is of course Marguerite, and she watches from the sidelines not only the fate of her husband, but also her fate. As repeated throughout the film, if her husband lost the duel, it was divine judgment that she was lying about her accusations. So she would be burned at the stake for bearing false witness. Now the film is presented in 3 acts. The first 2 are given from the men's perspective, first to her husband Carouge and second to Legris, and the third and final act is through Marguerite's point of view. The legal machinery depicted in the film is quite patriarchal and cruel. Marguerite initially tells her husband, Carouge, about her rape, and Carouge is infuriated. He goes to seek a trial by jury, but apparently the liege lord, Count Pierre, played by Ben Affleck, would rule over this trial by jury, and Count Pierre loved Legris, so there was no point. So seeking alternative justice, Carouge petitions the king for a trial by combat. The repetitive scenes portrayed throughout the film emphasize the different points of view and the sticky nature of dealing with truth. According to one movie critic, quote, "The thorny nature of truth in Marguerite's case, which has divided observers both at her time and centuries since." Some argue that she had falsely accused Legris, either mistaking him for someone else or on the orders of her vindictive husband. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire favored Legris's cause, decrying his barbaric and unjust trial by combat as an example of the supposed ignorance and cruelty of Middle Ages, end quote. So quite clearly, the validity of Marguerite's accusations were debated not only amongst her contemporaries, but for centuries afterwards. The notoriety of this case is largely derived from the fact that it was the last royal sanctioned duel in France, and that it led to the downfall of Legris, a prominent member of the French nobility. This is a very rare instance where a member of the nobility, the elites of medieval society, are not only having to go to trial, in a sense, to face rape accusations, but to actually suffer the punitive measures. I want to contextualize this case and surround it in the legal and cultural and religious framework around rape and sexuality, around consent and culpability, to understand how this case of Marguerite compares to the infamous case of Eleanor West in England just 4 years prior, where it was legally sanctioned that a duel could not happen. So England and France at this time, in the 14th century, are intricately interconnected. They're sharing people, they're sharing religions, they're sharing languages and culture. Indeed, the entire 100 Years' War from about 1337 to 1453 can be attributed to this close connection between France and England. There was a dispute about sovereignty and the role of women in reproduction. When Philip IV, King of France, died with no living male heir, his only child was Isabella. Isabella was married to King Edward II of England. Their marriage is depicted on the screen. She eventually became the mother to the future King of England, Edward III. Now, Isabella, as the only living child of the King of France, claimed that she passed on her father's royal seed to her son, acting as the motherly vessel. And she claimed that her son was the closest living legitimate male descendant to the French throne. He just happened to be the King of England as well. Now, understandably, the Valois cousins disputed this fact and said that the woman passes on no male lineage at all to their children. And Edward III made an attempt for the French throne, and this really sparks the 100 Years' War. So to contextualize Marguerite's case and that of Eleanor West, there's really a heightened anxiety on both sides of the English Channel in the 14th century about women and sexuality, about their roles of reproduction in male lineage, male patrimony. And these issues and debates are intricately woven within the fabric of the laws around rape and abduction, known as Raptus laws. So I'm just going to very briefly highlight 4 of the legal ages of England's secular rape laws that show a gradual displacement from the woman as the victim to her male kin. Now, before I get started, I just want to highlight very briefly that when I use terms such as woman victim and male rapist, it's strictly because the gender binaries are written into the laws themselves. I'm offering just a true translation of the laws, and it was legally impossible from a medieval perspective for a man to be a victim of rape. So I'm just offering that right now. So I want to begin with Bracton. Bracton is a mid to late 13th century common law treatise, very widely popular. And in it, Bracton is only concerned about the rape of virgins, no one else. Bracton states that the rape of virgins should be punished by death, castration, and blinding. Bracton states that the man should, quote, lose his eyes, which gave him sight of the maiden's beauty, and the testicles, which excited his hot lust, end quote. So the genital mutilation of the guilty man, and also that of his horse, dog, and hawk, was the prerogative of the woman. She alone could save him from mutilation and blinding if she wanted to marry him. Now, I know this seems very jarring to many modern audiences, But the marriage between the woman and the rapist actually, from a medieval perspective, saved the woman's reputation and ensured her marriage market value was protected. So it was considered the honorable thing for the man to do. So, I call this the marriage clause and rape clause. And we're going to see frustration over this marriage clause because it was the woman's choice. If she wanted to marry her rapist, that was all that was required, her consent and no one else's. Now, Bracton outlines the appeal process that the raped woman must follow, in stating that, quote, she must go at once while the deed is newly done, show the injury done to her to men of good repute, the blood in her clothing stained with blood, and garments. The coroner was ordered to view the said wounds and measure their length and depth. So the legal process was initiated by the woman. It was her right to bring the appeal forward. And they were quite literally looking at her body for proof of the crime. Now, the most common defense to these charges was, of course, claiming that the woman was still a virgin. And in that case, Bracton tells lawmakers that let the truth be ascertained by an examination of her body, made by 4 law-abiding women sworn to tell the truth, whether she's a virgin or defiled, end quote. The inspection of the body was once again done to determine the validity of the crime, but it was done by other women, and this is a very unique legal medical scenario where men relied on the testimony of women in court. And I think it's arguable that this is the only time in felony trials where women's authority, women's testimony, had such power in the king's court. Now, I found one such case where a woman's body was put under inspection. It comes from the Court of the General Eyre during the Bracton era, that of a woman named Marjorie. She's referred to as Marjorie, daughter of Peter Lefevre. In 1264, Marjorie made her appeal that a man named Thomas, quote, both raped her with force and made her bleed, end quote. Thomas challenged the appeal by stating that, quote, when he violated her against her will, it was when she was not a virgin. The record then states that Thomas made satisfaction to Marjorie. This shows the numerous instances where sexual intercourse with non-consent and physical bodily injury were established. But because of Bracton's emphasis on the loss of virginity, the inspection of the woman's body to determine virginal status was crucial to either the success or failure of the case. There is also, I believe, a very strong reluctance among jurors to send their neighbors to castration and blinding, and all attempts would be made to downgrade the offense from a felony to a trespass. Now, Bracton, of course, allows the woman to claim the man as her husband if she wishes, but he also warns lawmakers of malicious rape appeals used by women who are jealous of a man's sexual union with another woman. And these women will do fictitious and vindictive rape claims to trap good and honest men into marriage. So we're starting to see here the binary legal identities. We have a truly innocent victim who's got very evident physical bodily injury of an attack, and this kind of scheming and vindictive woman. Now, at one point in the film, Adam Driver's character of Legreese is advised to claim lower clergyman status to avoid the duel. This brief moment in the film is not elaborated on, but it highlights a very frequent means for which men would frequently claim to be members of the church to avoid the king's law. If a man was accused of rape and he was a member of the church, he could not be tried in the king's courts. He had to be tried in church courts. Now, from my research, the punishments under the church courts were penance, usually a fine, and the potential of excommunication. Now, it seems like this was an attractive alternative to the potential of blinding, castration, and mutilation, and even death under the king's law. And from my research, there's a lot of men who claim to be clergymen. There's actually such an overrepresentation of clergymen accused of rape that some scholars have debated whether or not rape was a rite of passage for young clergymen in the Middle Ages. I believe that the benefit of the clergy being able to be tried in the church courts was just an attractive way to escape the much harsher punishments. And from my research, I have yet to find a single case where excommunication was prescribed. All of them just end in a fine and the man is free to go. This must have seemed like a much more attractive alternative to the secular courts. However, Legris in the film objects to it because it would require him to admit guilt. Now, the first statutory law in England on rape comes in the enactment of the Statute of Westminster, the first Statute of Westminster in 1275, where rape is downgraded from a felony to a trespass. And it implemented a new clause which gave women only 40 days to appeal their case. Now, this might speculatively be due to the fact that within 40 days, the woman has to show the coroner evidence of her wounds as proof of her accusation, and proof might disappear if wounds heal. The coroner was ordered once again to view the woman's body. So it says that if any be appealed of rape, if the appeal be fresh, and they must see apparent sign of truth by fusion of the blood. So once again, the woman's body is used to determine the validity of a crime. Of the 21 appeals I have looked at during the era of Westminster I, only 4 were successful in obtaining a trial. So this is still an era where women have the right to be able to bring their appeal forward. So out of 21 women who said I had been raped, only 4 were believed enough to go to a trial. Out of those 4, 3 ended in acquittal, and all 3 women were sent to prison for false appeal. So it's notable that unlike the Last Duel's depiction of Marguerite, where she's going to be burned at the stake for bearing false witness, in England they preferred to throw them in prison with the option of paying a fine to the king. Now, the first Statute of Westminster was replaced just 10 years later with the second Statute of Westminster in 1285. And with the second Statute of Westminster, rape becomes a felony charge again, and we're told that this law, the law of protecting women, was applicable to, quote, any woman, whether she be a virgin or not, who experienced violence on her body. So the law is telling us virginity doesn't matter. It's an emphasis on the body of the woman and the use of force by the man. Now I want to highlight one case from the Hertfordshire era of 1287, that of Agnes, daughter of John, who appealed Hugo Fitzthomas the tenure of raping her virginity. So this is under the era of Westminster too. The record states, which is pictured on the screen, that Hugo, quote, seized her and bruised her, and with force lied with her, and that he, quote, violently made her bleed from the middle of her face and nose, end quote. It's recorded that Agnes was a child at the time of the attack. She was not yet 7 years old. The jury found Agnes to still be a virgin, so the entire case was downgraded to a trespass because the rape was not completed, despite the violent assault against young Agnes. So clearly, the attempted rape of a minor and the violent attack was of less of a concern to the loss of virginity, despite the indifference to virginal status in the statute itself, right? It said applicable to any woman, whether a virgin or not. It's worth noting that Marguerite in the Last Duel was married at the time of her accusations. And this would have been considerably less of a concern, legally speaking, than the rape of a young maiden with the potential loss of virginity, as the laws themselves, the trial records, and popular public opinion attest to. Now, looking at ecclesiastical and medical texts, it's evident that ecclesiastics, members of the church, had a more nuanced perspective of consent, but when it came to the crime of rape, they ultimately viewed it as a physical crime, much like the secular courts. A monk named Grattan wrote a widely popular canon law textbook. It essentially becomes the textbook for canon law in every university in medieval Europe. And in that textbook, Grattan states that, quote, many authorities prove that purity cannot be destroyed by force, for it is a virtue of the mind and so cannot be touched by violence, end quote. In referencing the virgin martyrs in the preservation of the chastity of the mind during rape, Grattan claims that there is a clear distinction between consent of the flesh and consent of the mind. Maidens who survive rape but lose their virginity can still be pure chastity if they never mentally consented to the rape. However, in reality, theologians and men of law were extremely hesitant to believe women who claimed mental non-consent because of the weakness of the flesh, believed to be biologically inherent in female anatomy, thanks largely to Eve, was so strong that it could overpower the woman's mental non-consent. So this brings me to the issue of conception, which was really at the forefront of Marguerite's questioning during her interrogation in The Last Duel. Notable English physician William McContis states, quote, "For what is often displeasing to the rational mind is pleasing to the flesh. Therefore, even though there is no will of reason in a raped woman, there is pleasure of the flesh." The acknowledgement of the mental non-consent of rape survivors, but the physical consent of the flesh, evident through pregnancy, was grounded in the contemporary understanding of anatomy. The two-seed theory of conception was logical from a rudimentary understanding of anatomy, which was grounded on the one-sex model. As you can see from the manuscript images on the slide, the male anatomy on the left with its penis and testicles appears inverted on the diagram on the right of the uterus and ovaries. The idea that men visibly produce a seed when sexually aroused, which is necessary for procreation, and that women with inverted male anatomy must also produce a less visible seed when aroused, which must also be necessary for procreation, was widely accepted as fact. So these courts viewed these pregnant rape survivors as willing in their flesh. Somehow their body enjoyed it, or else they wouldn't have released the seed, which is necessary for procreation, even though they may have mentally non-consented. Now, from the one case I have that includes pregnancy from rape, that is Joan from Kent in 1313. The acquittal of the accused rapist was based entirely on her pregnancy. The record states that Joan's pregnancy was, quote, "a wonderful thing, since a child could not be begotten unless both were consenting parties," end quote. This suggests that, to the courts, the mental non-consent was irrelevant. Joan was adamant that she never mentally consented, but it didn't matter in the felony trial. Her body consented, which was for pregnancy, and the felony charge was dropped. Now, this so-called benefit of the belly is mentioned in The Last Duel. Marguerite is pregnant during the time of her inquisition, during her questioning, which leads to immense skepticism about her claims. If the father of the child is the very man she's appealing in court, it would prove legally and medically that her body enjoyed it, that she consented. So there'd be no felony charge. Conception in medieval England and France automatically eliminated a felony charge. Now, what is clear from the 12th to the 14th century is that the burden of proof of these accusations lay entirely on the woman's body. And when I look at actual trial documents and popular public opinion, there's standard phrases of expectations of tokens of proof to make your case believable. So here on the screen are the three identities that I believe the laws construct of women who go to court to appeal rape. It's entirely on the physical bodily proof. You have the innocent victim and the scheming culpable woman as entirely binary opposites based on either the lack of evidence or the physical evidence that there is. Hair, was your hair disturbed? Do you have torn clothing? Do you have bruising or bleeding? This third identity, I call the reluctant but willing accomplice. This is where the woman may have mental non-consent. Sometimes the courts say, okay, we believe you probably didn't consent mentally, but the body consented, the body enjoyed it. So you're reluctant but ultimately a willing accomplice to your own rape, which is proven through pregnancy. The legal necessity of having physical injuries to be believed in court worked to sustain a burden of proof that laid entirely on the woman. Now I want to just return briefly to the Statute of Westminster II in the issue of consent. Westminster II was enacted in 1285, and it remained in place for nearly 100 years until 1382. One scholar has claimed that in that 1285 to 1382, that medieval England had a 10% conviction rate to rape appeals. Now, examining historical continuity and conviction rates is beyond the scope of my research, but a quick search on Statistics Canada stated that in Canada we have a 12%. Westminster II was eventually replaced in 1382 by the Statute of Rapes. This new Statute of Rapes gave the power to appeal rape away from the woman. It was always her right to bring her case forward, and it made it entirely the right of her male kin, husbands and fathers. It took away all the women's legal rights, and the woman's consent was entirely irrelevant to the felony charge. The statute states that if a woman consents at any time in her life, she's treated as dead in the sense that her inheritance immediately passes over her and goes to the next in line. The statute was clearly aiming at protecting family wealth and inheritance and ensuring parental approval of marriages. There was a lot of issues with women using that marriage clause to marry people for love and perhaps not for marriage alliances. This begs the question, at what point does a woman prove her non-consent to be a victim if she can potentially consent at any point in her life until she dies? Well, the statute didn't think she was ever a victim. The new victim of the crime of rape was her male kin, her father or her husband. So we're seeing an entire displacement here. The statute was aimed at the crime of seduction and voluntary elopement. The circumstances that initiated these really severe laws were due to one daring young woman, Eleanor. In the summer of 1381, Eleanor West was riding in the woods of Southampton with her mother. We know this because in the summer of 1381, Sir Thomas West, her father, an elite nobleman in England, petitioned the king in help for avenging the rape and abduction of his daughter, Eleanor. Thomas West wrote in his petition that his wife Alice and his daughter Eleanor were riding in the woods when Nicholas Clifton, an employee of his, an associate of his, led the girls deliberately into deeper and thicker woods, where they were ambushed by a group of armed men, at which point Nicholas abducted Eleanor. The petition, which is pictured on the screen to the left, was read in English Parliament, and the Statute of Rapes was passed the following Parliament, 1382. Now, the fictitious abductions and rapes of wealthy women was not rare. These elite daughters were rarely given a chance to choose who they got to marry. So that marriage clause in rape laws, if you faked an abduction, you legally had a legally binding pathway to choose who you got to marry, because your parents' consent didn't matter. The laws say only the woman's consent to marry matters. And that was a very attractive alternative to arranged marriages. Now, the statute of rape states that, quote, the husbands of such women, or if they have none, then their fathers, may sue against the offenders and ravishers. And further, it is accorded that the defendant in this case shall not be received in battle, but rather that the truth of the matter be thereof tried by inquisition. So there are two new legal developments in the statute of rapes. The first was through monetary control. The family wealth remained protected by legally counting the eloping daughter or wife as dead, meaning that she could never get her inheritance, which in Thomas's case, Eleanor's inheritance was quite substantial. The second novel was the extended power of the male kin. The legal ability of a woman to bring her case forward, which in every other legal age was exclusively the right of the woman, was now entirely the right of her husband or father. This is very reminiscent of Carouge's appeal in the movie The Last Duel, where he initiates the duel process. And it very much shows a displacement of Marguerite, where she's no longer the victim of the crime, but Carouge is, her husband. It's an attack on his honor. It's an attack on his property. He's kind of Thomas West here. Now, to further protect family interests, the statute eliminates any potential of a duel, a trial by combat, between an older father and a potentially much younger doctor. And instead, the statute requires that for rapes, you have to use a trial by jury. Now, clearly, Thomas West feared having to fight the much younger, potentially much more fit, much more capable fighter of Nicholas Clifton. The fear of a younger man fighting in a judicial trial by combat shows, I think, that there was a lack of confidence in the divinely ordained outcome, or else why the heck would Thomas worry? I think we can see, and this is not a new sentiment. In 1382, there's a long lineage getting to this point. In the 12th century, we see a gradual distrust to trial by ordeals and trial by combats, and a growing movement to exclusively use trial by juries. In in France and England by the 14th century, we almost see no trial by ordeals or trial by duels, and instead, I have only ever found trial by juries for rape cases. The infrequency of the duel is even hinted at in the movie, where French King Charles VI notes that no one really duels anymore. I think this adds to the infamy of the case itself by bringing back an outdated and unreliable judicial infrastructure, even by medieval standards. Now, soon after the enactment of the Statute of Rape, Sir Thomas West makes a second petition directly to the king, begging for the statute to be applied retrospectively to his daughter Eleanor. He states in this second petition that Nicholas Clifton made a horrible assault and feloniously ravished and deflowered, so took her virginity, of Eleanor, and that he now fears that Eleanor has married Nicholas. Thomas wishes her to be included in the statute so that she couldn't get her inheritance, which was quite large. This would protect Thomas's family wealth. It would ensure that the lower status Nicholas Clifton couldn't get his hands on it, which would hopefully, in Thomas's mind, provoke them to seek an annulment. Now, we do know that Eleanor married Nicholas, and that she stayed married to him. Years later, after the death of her father, it appears that her mother Alice forgave her elopement, as in her will in 1395, Alice left a large inheritance for Eleanor, her husband Nicholas, and their young son, ironically named Thomas. The case of Eleanor West highlights how young women manipulated the marriage clause in rape laws to marry people of considerably lower status and against parental consent. And it demonstrates that never happened, in that Thomas West explicitly did not want to fight Nicholas Clifton, and his petition legally outlawed duels for rapes in England just 4 years prior to the last duel in France. Necessarily a bad thing. Time limits me to further into the Me Too movement and Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Give these many other examples. They powerfully demonstrate how central how central rape can be to cultural tropes about agency and identity. The issues that we're grappling with right now, what was she wearing? What was she doing there? How much was she drinking? These were all questions that were in the Middle Ages as well. Although Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, who co-wrote the script Last Duel, stated that there was a certain degree of artistic liberty taken with Marguerite's case, since, quote, the world of women had to be almost invented and imagined back then, end quote. I want to push back on that slightly. Court records, trial records, those are sources of resistance. These
in 3 then being in prison. Was that an automatic consequence of appeal, or would they have gone to trial as well?
No, that was an automatic consequence, which I think really speaks to the dangers that these women face. Not only their potential damaged reputation, the money to go to trial,